My name is Tracy Keatman. I work for an organisation called Partnerships in Practice. We used to be called Building Partnerships for Development in Water and Sanitation, which was the catchiest name, I think, in the wash sector, BPDWS, very catchy. We spent many years, from about 98 up until about 2 years ago, as an NGO, working with public-private partnerships and different forms of institutional arrangements, any form of public working with private and working with non-profit, and where do donors fit in that. So we were supported for many years by DFID and by the World Bank, really trying to understand these partnership institutional relationship dynamics. So I think, George, what you did earlier with your analogy about dating sets me up nicely here, because we always used to talk about our work in relation to being marriage guidance counsellors in BPD. That's what we were. It's what we still do now. We spent a lot of time doing the dating, who's going to get together with whom, why, do they really like each other, have they got the same values, that kind of thing, can they communicate? And then we... often not. And then thinking, well, can they actually be brought together? What happens when they get married, as it were?
Counselling.
Yeah, counselling, that's what happens next. So we looked at a lot of contracts, and, in terms of the context, we were right in the middle of the kind of storm around big private sector involvement in public service delivery. So lots of big fights that we had along the way. And so we did a lot of marriage guidance counselling, and we did quite a lot of divorce management. So with that in mind, that's who I am, where I come from. Although at the moment I am still focused on sanitation, working with WaterAid on a piece looking at city sanitation planning and how that links up, of course, with the role of entrepreneurs. And also looking at sanitation business models and how do we support that on the ground, like what is the role of NGOs, of other support agencies, what can they practically do? And we heard some really good examples from WUSUP and WaterAid just now on their activities. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce my audience. Now I got my panel. I've got the panel to send me a bit of information about themselves, so I feel it would be a bit of a disservice if I just said, oh, there's Jane, this is Noemi, here's Remy. So just because I have some information on them, I'm going to share it with you now. So first of all, we have Jane over here. Jane is actually the infrastructure advisor for the water, sanitation and hygiene team in the policy division in DFID. She's a Master of Engineering and also in Policy Management. So Masters and an MSc, I noted there, Master of Engineering and MSc. And it does sound very impressive. And she initially worked in the private sector, actually, focusing on landfill and solid waste transfer facilities. So actually a lot of different things that we're starting to look at now, very relevant to Jane's expertise and experience. She worked as an engineering advisor for DFID in the UK and also in South Africa. And then she worked with WaterAid Bangladesh for some years. So a lot of experience from her time in Bangladesh. And also looking at infrastructure more broadly, so looking at energy and infrastructure too. Back to DFID, and she's been focusing on role and engagement of sanitation entrepreneurs and focused on urban sanitation and private sector subsectors. This is her main mandate and role at DFID. Then here to my right, I have Noemi de la Brosse, and she is an inclusive markets consultant at Practical Action Consulting, which is the consultancy arm of Practical Action, the charity, for those that don't know. So Noemi is a markets and urban wash specialist with experience from looking at solid waste management in Mexico and currently working on fecal sludge management in Bangladesh, specifically supporting the Gates-funded program there on public-private partnership for fecal sludge management in Faridpur. So she'll be telling us a little bit more about the role of the base of the pyramid engagement and what we can do to really work with people. And so here, George.
You got a second introduction.
You get a second introduction. You've told us a little bit more, but we know as well that you have a master's from WEDEC as well at Loughborough and been focused on urban sanitation predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, and we've heard a bit more about your work. And you've also been working on market studies, business development and public sector engagement. So when the time comes, I'll be asking you to tell us a little bit more about how you work as well with the public sector, whether that's utility or different local government authorities. Just giving him a heads up here, so don't just ask him a big question from the start. So that's the kind of area I might be coming to you to discuss. And then further on my left, I've got Remy Cup from WaterAid, and he is the officer in the Programme Support Unit of WaterAid. He's a specialist in urban sanitation too, MSc in Engineering for Development from Southampton Uni, has worked with Oxfam Haiti, emergency architects as a WASH engineer in post-disaster housing construction, a lot here. Homeless International, so also understands this dynamic between land, management, housing and sanitation, so we may come back to you on that point as well. And he's focused now on looking at the role and actions of social enterprises and the use of microfinance to support them, which we heard a little bit about from Ada just now in the presentation from WaterAid. And just to finish off with Remy here, he's also been looking at WaterAid on their disaster risk reduction work, so we can also bring in some elements there and ask a bit more about resilience. So that's who we have for our panel. I'd like to thank also our online colleagues for joining us for this session. And we've heard quite a lot about some of the barriers for engagement or some of the challenges that we face. And our particular panel session here is to look at both those barriers and some of the opportunities that we foresee. So what I'll just basically ask the panel to do initially is just to provide a few words from their perspective, from their organisation or from their experience, what they see are actually some of the key barriers, but actually, and more positively, what are some of the opportunities? Trying to move our agenda forward. How can we learn from each other? This is, of course, why we're all here in the room, but how do we actually effect change? So with that, perhaps I'll just ask Jane to talk to us a little bit more about what she sees in that regard, and then we'll take questions once we've heard from all the panel.
Okay, thank you, Tracy. I'll just open with a couple of statements. I'm sitting here sort of with a bit of an experience hat on, but also as a donor who's been working for the last few months in trying to really clarify where we as a donor can actually play the most effective and catalytic role with the resources that we have, whilst playing the sort of political games about whether we're actually going to get any resources to do it with. But that's an ongoing process. I think we discussed this morning the issue of scale, and I'm coming back to that now. I know it's sort of coming up through the discussion, but in the climate of SDGs and the fact that we talk about the backlog and the number of people who still have to have access, I find the discussion still sort of wanders around the projectized approach issue. And even the governments that you're working with in developing countries are still looking at the projects in urban sanitation. So when you're talking about scale, very interested to know, on the one hand, what the private sector can do, who are the sorts of organisations we can work with to actually start moving things faster. We talked about the speed with which you can engage, working with systems, working in parallel with systems, but agreeing with George, ultimately ensuring that both public and private are moving along as far as possible together. But that for us is about maybe looking at some of the organisations we think are the most appropriate to really align, see coming together, coordinate, align, sort of an emphasis on their communications, their reach into the developing country situation, the bottom of the pyramid situation. On the public side, incentives for the public utilities to begin to engage in public-private partnerships. If it's important that they're brought along, then do we want to ensure that we're sort of investing our resources in looking at what those incentives are, maybe doing a little bit of research around what we can really do to support that. On the other hand, the role of the big private sectors, the corporate social responsibility, what can we do to maybe to support that such that it really does help to stimulate the market, support the market, and generate and support small-scale businesses from a different angle. Sorry, that's quite a lot. I'll stop there.
Great. No, thank you. Thank you very much. Noemi, maybe I'll come to you next.
So practical action has a very clear vision. When we started that program in Bangladesh, the idea was to apply a very systemic and inclusive lens on our sanitation work. So we've been working a lot with including. I think the first point I'm going to throw was to work with the existing system that was in Faridpur, the town where we're working. The idea was to make sure we were including and engaging with the informal sector that was already present and actually delivering sanitation service. It is still informal. It's being regulated, but the idea was to just base the work on what was existing there. And that brings me to a couple of points in terms of opportunities and barriers. What we saw by working with these informal PTM groups, that there was a lot to do around the incentives to bring these people into an improved sanitation system. So what kind of incentive can you give to those groups to actually take the sludge to a disposal site that was funded by the Gates Foundation? What's the incentive for these people to actually engage and remain engaged along the process? And therefore, what are the sanctions, or like what the punishment or the what kind of mechanism can you put in place so these people can't cheat too much with the system you put in place? Because that's been one of the main challenges we've found out recently, that there's so many ways for those groups to actually cheat and dispose the sludge somewhere else where the system is thinking to dispose it. Another point that was very, very striking in our project in Bangladesh was that we were very lucky to have a very strong political willingness to put in place a city-wide sanitation system. That the push was coming from the municipality. We're now facing, which was a very positive point initially. We're now like the other side of the coin here, that we're now facing some political challenges, because the continuity of the political willingness can come to an end. So the mayor that was in place at the beginning of the project is now coming at the end of his mandate. It's like, hang on a minute, the treatment plant that you're building there is not going to be my treatment plant anymore, because I'm going to leave my seat to another mayor. What's my benefit in making this project working? What's the benefit of the next mayor to actually keep the project running? So this is also, I think, a barrier that we should take into account when it comes to choosing a location and to identify the right partners. You can have the right partners, and people are very engaged at the beginning, and the political situation there is very important and to take into account, I think, for the scale-up. Because right now we're looking at 3 wards out of the 9 that the program is targeting. 3 wards, so small neighborhoods, to pilot that. But if you want to scale it up, you need people on your side. So I guess that's one of the main points. And I guess, again, part of our project is also looking at influencing the national sanitation framework. So there's a huge amount of work to be done around influencing the government to actually create an enabling environment for these businesses to have like a strong enough incentive to engage in the process and to stay engaged in that process. Because we've been looking at the end of if you remember the chain, right? Like at the end, well, you have disposal, treatment, and reuse. What about the reuse? So we've been looking at potential around co-compost of dried fecal sludge, organic fertilizers. And surprise, surprise, what do we find? There are very strong barriers to the reuse of dried fecal sludge into organic fertilizers, for example. So these are elements that could represent a huge opportunity to get people engaged as a business into the sanitation value chain, service and value chain, and you find out in the end that the reuse is not as easy as it could sound initially, because the national framework and the certification procedure are very complex around this. So I guess that's what I wanted to highlight, and we can come back to it later.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, coming next to the men on the right, we noted our great gender balance on this panel. So handing over to George next.
Okay. I think depends on the context. I think in different contexts, different opportunities and challenges. There definitely, I feel sometimes there's a lot more challenges and you need counselling, but there are opportunities, and I think is it Naomi? Yeah, Naomi. Sorry, what you mentioned was very important about. So it's really useful to have that champion, but sometimes that champion feels like a cowboy, where he's there one day and then the other day he's not, and then you kind of lose it. And what you're saying is it kind of moves on. So how do you use that support, political support, and that push from the top? There's a really interesting study by WaterAid about, is it East Asia recently? Which, sorry, this is not WASP interpretation, it's my own interpretation, which sounded like essentially have dictators that works a lot better to kind of push policies through.
That wasn't the intended policies.
That was my own interpretation. It seems like the easiest way, because they hang out a lot longer, don't they?
Continuity.
Yes, continuity.
Yeah.
Sorry, please, take that off the notes, please. But I think the alternative to that is developing relationships within the municipalities, within kind of the technocrats. So you get the push from the top, and then working with the technocrats, really getting them on board, getting them to eventually be the ones pushing this through. And I think that is a struggle, and that's something we struggle with every day at WSIP, and we work with utilities and with municipalities quite a bit. And sometimes you feel you're euphoric, you have an excellent relationship, and one thing happens and all of a sudden you feel like you're in the naughty corner. It's not an easy thing to build, and having that reputation relationship takes a lot of time and effort. The other opportunity, I would say, there's existing policies, existing frameworks within the countries we work with. Sometimes that municipalities don't really have the means, not really interested to implement. So, for example, in Ghana, there's a huge push for public-private sector partnerships, but how do you translate that on the ground? There's a big push for sanitation plans. They write sanitation plans, they're copy and paste every year, the same thing. It doesn't really change much, but how do you translate that sanitation plan, or take one section of it and say, how do we implement that now on the ground? And you take it from a plan to implementation. So there are those opportunities that are maybe less obvious, but they're there, and it's for us to kind of see them and take the opportunity to use them. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And Remy?
Okay. Hi. I hope you enjoy French accents today. Okay, I was thinking about the barriers and opportunities, and there's one area where I feel there's a strong barrier in our urban work is the links with other sectors, looking a bit beyond sanitation, beyond WASH, and especially housing. I say housing as a verb, so the action of housing people, not just the physical house. Architects and planners tend to think about the built environment at the same time. And there's a lot to consider about it. We sometimes forget that putting sanitation in one area, or enabling the private sector to install sanitation somewhere, it's a political act. If you do this in a slum, suddenly it becomes formal. It becomes a place that has economic value. So, I mean, this is, to answer a bit Mansour, this is where we can't avoid dealing with the public sector, because it is a political act. And many organizations have learned this really well. So the Slum Dwellers International and the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights, these two networks have learned a lot what it means to put sanitation. They see it as a continuum, as part of the continuum towards better living conditions and towards more empowerment. And leading towards better housing eventually. Sanitation is just one of the first steps towards there. But interestingly, these networks have achieved also considerable impact in terms of building markets. So you look at their work in Mumbai, for example, they've used market forces to develop housing and sanitation at a really big scale, on understanding really how it works with the big players. So I think an opportunity here is to learn a lot from this sort of actions. Another one would be to learn what works, what causes change at the scale of a city or a country. So the East Asia research that you mentioned was about learning from a few selected East Asian countries how they achieved total sanitation coverage. Was it really just pure public investment? What role did the private sector play? So yes, one of the highlights was that a strong and stable government is better. So yes, dictators unfortunately can help, but that's not the main policy point. Actually, in all these cases, it was strong public investments. Now we're looking at broadening the case study base for this, and we're doing this with partnerships in practice, learning how cities are able to plan sanitation services, but plan on facilitate this with other actors. And again, learning from the housing history. Virtually no country these days has massive social housing done by the public sector. It was the Marshall Plan, it was the idea in many countries, but now no government is really building masses of housing for the poor. They've shifted to roles of enablers, of facilitators, of coordinators with the private sector, depending on the country. Whether that's right or not, well, that's how the world is these days, and we can learn a lot on how they've built policies that actually work for investment there. And I think the final opportunity is looking at similar sectors like solid waste management. There isn't, we're trying to invent a lot of things in fecal sludge management, on looking a lot at the private sector to help us. But there is very little incentive in emptying a pit. And it's about as uninteresting to shovel shit as it is to collect garbage, really. And yet, we've got very good businesses doing solid waste management, collection and treatment, and we've seen a lot of various contracting methods, of planning methods around the world, and this is typically a sector where a lot more has been done, a lot more has happened in innovation, and where the private sector plays a big role. So again, we've got a lot to learn from this. And again, looking at Mansour, who's done a lot of work in this area. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So thank you to all the panel for this first reflection on some of the barriers and opportunities for engagement with more engagement with market actors. And just keeping an eye on the time there, we've just got 20 minutes left, within which we can take some questions. I was going to suggest that maybe we could look specifically at what some of the opportunities are, just so that we can share a bit more of our learning and the positive learning that we have amongst us, and really trying to figure out, well, how do we actually engage with some of these market actors? What are the steps we take? We heard from WaterAid, from Ada's presentation, literally about some of the processes the steps that they take in the process and some of their key learnings, which it's great that they shared. And also from WUSUP. It would be interesting to hear from some of you and to also interrogate the panel a little bit more about how we actually do this. How do we break down these barriers and find the opportunities for greater engagement? Of course, if your question isn't related to that, I'll still take it. I'm not being dictatorial. But, do you have any specific questions in relation to this area? To the panel? Ada, come to you first.
Thank you very much. Very interesting opening already. My question is very specifically on the subject of incentives. I've heard that word from the beginning of the discussion this morning, incentives. I'm looking for very practical examples of how do you incentivize this market. Who's worked with government to bring about this, and maybe WhatsApp tell us some more about tax exemptions and all of that, specifically to businesses? Where do we have these examples where businesses around sanitation have been incentivized? Because I think that is critical if we're thinking in terms of social business setup and all of that. What should motivate people to engage this, and particularly from the government side, what the government can do in terms of creating that enabling environment and incentivizing the sector? Thank you.
Great, thank you. And second question over here, please.
Thank you, Antoinette Salam. My question is to the panelists. It's the issue about continuity and also how to implement. Do you think that it's the lack of institutional and legal framework rather than the political system that is in place?
Great, thank you. Thank you. Take a question here and then over from Marielle. Oh, yep. Oh, sorry. Well, let's come to this one first. Then you don't have to run so far with the microphone.
Thanks. We've heard lots of things today about the opportunity that there is in working with existing market actors, and sometimes those can be pit emptiers, for example. and there seem to be lots of really positive opportunities for that. I think I'd like to find out from the panel what some of the challenges there are that go along with that opportunity, because often some of these people who are engaged in things like pit emptying are particularly vulnerable. They have ended up in that job because there aren't other things and other opportunities they can do. That they have a set of challenges that aren't just your standard business practice challenges, and how people are dealing with that because these are groups of people who are particularly vulnerable in all kinds of ways.
Thank you. I'll take the two questions I spotted over here. There was one, and then the gentleman at the back.
Yeah. My question is also similar to Ada's question, because I think it's one of the aspects, not about incentives as such, although that's obviously also a key issue, but about the enabling environment. It's based on the experiences that we've had, and the one example that I didn't get the chance to mention in the panel is a study that we've been doing for the last 3 with the Dutch Water Alliance in Ghana, Uganda, and Ethiopia. And in that study, what was so extremely interesting is before anything was done, community members with the local partners came together and reflected on what it is that they wanted to do, then got involved in the market that they wanted to focus on. Within the context of Ghana, it was on public toilets. Ethiopia was on shower cubicle schemes. And in Uganda, it was around sanitation market for the households. Through that process, they were able, which is interesting, after a 3-year period, to actually make these schemes marketable. I am curious from the panel to get more reflections about the aspects of an enabling environment. We've come up with our own list in IRC, but I'm very curious to hear what aspects you think are of critical importance around that.
Thank you. This gentleman at the back, thank you.
All right, my name is Warren Mangolwa. I'm actually working in Zambia, where George did much of his work from. My concern, possibly a question too, is on the level of engagement that we're having as donors. I work for SNV. How does this help in ensuring that we've got sustainable markets? Most of the challenges that we've experienced on the field is that people that are engaged in sanitation, the businesses, are often enshrined because they see some donor-driven market. It's project-oriented. So oftentimes, these are not very sustainable because they come to an end soon as the donors drive out. So how do we ensure that there's a proper mix between the private sector, donors, as well as the government to ensure for sustainability?
Great, thank you. Okay, so we've got 5 areas there around incentives, continuity, working with existing actors. Who are they? Who are these people that have barriers for engaging with us in sanitation? The enabling environment, and also donor engagement and the impact of what happens when they leave. So perhaps I'd like to first ask Jane to reflect on this, because I know also that she's written a very interesting piece on incentives for small-scale providers to get involved in sanitation. So heading to you first for some thoughts on that and the other topics too, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, and I may not touch on all of these points here, but maybe certainly addressing that question 3 about the existing market actors and working with them. I did a little bit of work, and it was very much about it was sanitation entrepreneurs, but it was sort of incentives behind people engaging in either being pit emptiers or coming into the business, or being or taking small mason construction businesses further. The incentives behind it, I think most people will actually have more or less knowledge of that anyway, and it is things like having a little bit of family money behind you. Nobody's really going to get involved in a business unless they've probably got a little business handed down to them by their father or something. So people don't just sort of suddenly engage in building their own businesses. Equally, people don't take on loans to expand businesses. So I would have questions about those small businesses actually being able to serve beyond a donor market, as the gentleman referred to there. These small businesses have often come in and been trained up by donors, trained as part of a wider donor-funded or grant-funded project, but would question their ability to really go anywhere else. So the incentives maybe, or the ability to actually build on businesses lies elsewhere. To those who are actually already existing, successful business people who are looking to, and we talked a lot about diversification for resilience purposes, but I think diversification for just the reality of being able to expand and actually serve a wider network of customers. So maybe it doesn't quite talk to incentives there, but it is a little bit about existing market actors and whether they are the right people to actually take any kind of scaling up forward. They may not be. They may be people who are involved through their poverty, level of poverty, or there's cultural reasons. I mean, in Bangladesh, there's sort of the cultural hand-me-down in the Hindu communities around pit emptying, where my father was a sweeper and I'm a sweeper and my children are going to be sweepers. So huge cultural issues that dictate that. So certainly work with them, bring them in, and I think there's job opportunities. It sounds a bit crude in there for them, but they're not necessarily the businesses of the future. I have the questions myself about the incentives for the public sector to really engage. I don't have any silver bullets or answers for that. I would be interested to hear a little bit more from WUSUP about some of their experiences in that. I think I've answered a little bit towards the level of engagement of donors. I think it's a very good point that the gentleman from SNV made about sort of donor-driven projects. And I've seen the incentives, even when you try to sort of corporatise turn a little team of fecal sludge managers through NGO engagement, a subset of the NGO even. But then they're employees of the NGO. What are their reasons for doing it? Very altruistic. They think they're providing a good public service. There's no sort of private sector feeling about the operation that they're providing at all. They're not driven by profit margins or return on investment. So again, I think you're quite right. There's a challenge there to actually find different ways of delivering through the private sector rather than not that the NGO, it's not about not having a role for the NGOs, it's a different role, that's all.
Thank you. Well, and on that note, I'm going to actually jump across to Remy next, as you ended there on the role of NGOs, and just to hear your reflections on some of those questions, and also what you think is the real role or the forthcoming role that NGOs can really play. That's a big question for you, as Water Aid rep.
Yes. Okay. It's interesting on donor engagement. You know, we often beat ourselves hard because we think, oh, we are creating such a dependent environment on donors, on NGOs. And then you look at people providing sanitation services in the UK, the companies, and they just go from contract to contract. And they are heavily reliant on public money, on a tiny change in regulation in what's often public money, it's a huge threat for them. And I would ask whether that's a result of sanitation or this sort of services being public, on being considered a public good, and is it really possible to change this? So in our experience on working with small entrepreneurs, sure, some of them are actually willing to take risks if they've got that spirit, and that's great. But if they can get a contract, if they can get regular income, they will. And I understand that. It's horrible enough to empty pits without taking additional risks. So I would say we have to be clear about our end goal here. And as NGOs, sometimes we're not always very clear. When we support market actors, what do we do it for? Is it because we want them to grow and take over the city, the country, and therefore should this be a for-profit business? Are we really ready to do this? Are we ready to mobilize the kind of finance they need to formalize them? Or do we want this to become something that is funded or supported by the public sector, and therefore are we informing the future policies? Sometimes when we engage in this work, we are thinking, well, they're going to provide, sanitation services for this settlement, and that's going to be a great outcome at the end of this project. On what's next. So, and I would say that the answer depends on the context. Again, coming back to Mansour's question, should you bypass the public sector or should you work with them? I'd say that the culture defines this a lot. In countries when people turn to government like it's God, like France, or Tanzania, when you say, oh, let's engage in this, oh yes, we can check with the elected official and then with the one above, and we can get the permission and their support to do this. But that's the culture, and we're not going to change that really. So I think we need to be much more adaptable for this. On the question of incentives, I like that Jane, that you reverse this to what are the incentives for the public to get engaged in this. And I think this is maybe where we can link with the afternoon discussion that as humanitarian NGOs know very well, the shocks, the crises are also opportunities, and they cause a lot of change, actually. But they only can cause positive change if we can prepare the ground for this, if we can have an idea of if there are existing movements ready to effect some change, if there are some ideas of what can be built instead. So when there's the idea of building back better after disaster, or when there's a cholera or typhoid epidemic in a city, or when the River Thames start to stink, and what can be done. So if the Thames start to stink, well, it just happens that an engineer had proposed plans for sewers. So to link it back to our discussion, often we can, if the groundwork is in place, if there are existing solutions that are present, even at a smaller scale, can we use the shocks to showcase how they can work at a larger scale? If we have thought about what are the policy evolutions that can happen, are we ready to suggest them at the right times so that they can be put in action? It's not that we should hope for a crisis, but we should reconsider them, especially when they happen very often.
Great, thank you very much. Noemi, come to you.
Yeah, coming back on your question, Remy, about the role of NGOs. Well, we've had a lot of discussions in practical action about the distinction we make between temporary facilitators of change and the permanent ones. And the distinction is very important here that us NGO, we're only there for a short amount of time. We're here as a temporary facilitators to trigger change, but where the problem lies in depth is really with the municipality and the informal and then formalized sector in sanitation. So I guess like one of the main points is how to, as we said before, how to keep your local partners engaged, and I guess one of the things we need to improve, and I'm taking the example of that project, is how we understand the underlying reasons for informal groups to actually stay engaged in the process. So Lucy, you were raising the question around equity. So the municipality has a role, like a catalyst and regulator role to play, and they will most of the time provide services for those who can afford it. But what happens to the slum areas? What kind of mechanisms will make the municipality responsible for the whole sanitation chain, including the most remote areas, including the slum areas where most of those customers, because they are customers at the end of the day of a service, where these people can actually afford a service. So I guess the reflection goes back on how to understand better the interest of the most marginalized pit emptiers, for example, to get engaged. So there's no such thing as a perfect incentive mechanism. So you will have, of course, a good incentive is an incentive that will help achieving a goal. In our example, it's citywide sanitation, okay. But a good incentive will also be an incentive that will benefit the most marginalized existing actors. So how to make the pit emptiers better off at the end of the day, because that's what matters to them. Why would they get engaged if they're not getting, if they can't improve their situation and standard of life? And coming back on what you were saying, Alexi, about the diversity of products and of actors, when we were taking the example of Nairobi, where there are so many enterprises and so many actors available to provide the service. Well, in Faridpur, for example, in Bangladesh, the situation that the municipality and practical action is facing is like there is a big market imperfection. You know, we're always talking about the fact that you have a diversity and a lot of competitors, and that's how the markets gets regulated naturally. And in Faridpur, the issue is that we don't have enough candidates to run a treatment plant. There are not enough existing private actors, small businesses that are actually interested in running a treatment plant, because I can't see the point. Like, why would they risk all their money investing in that treatment plant if they can't get any profit out of it? So I guess there's a big question about what do you do when you don't have those SMEs available and like competing to win that kind of opportunity. And And I guess the last point is I was reading a presentation that's been sent by my colleagues from Bangladesh this morning on the train, and one of the lines were about we've been designing a lot of performance-based contract templates to try to transform P10 tier groups into enterprises. And I was like reading that because that's the bottom line of that project is to understand how to transform, formalize those informal P10 tier groups into businesses. And what are actually the right steps to get from an extreme to another? We're talking about very informal associations. How do you get these people from that point to a point where they have like accounting skills, where they can actually run that as a business? There's a lot to do around capacity building. Is that the role of the NGO? Is that the role of the municipality who at the end of the day is the permanent actor present on the ground? Are they actually willing to transfer those skills to informal groups and make them more responsible for service delivery, while at the beginning, municipality is responsible for that kind of service delivery. So it means that the municipality needs to accept and acknowledge that they're not filling their role, that they're not making that right. So they have to delegate that to people that they were considering as marginalized, remote, and didn't accept as part of the system initially. So there's a lot of behavior change, I guess, around this.
Thank you. And we just have a few minutes left, but I would like to come to George, because I think what we have heard a lot about is around the incentives and the challenges for finding the right ones in the right context and the right culture, and also those that speak to some of the equity issues that we're trying to deal with too, especially in light of the SDGs. So the two areas I feel maybe you could answer a little bit more on is this question about the enabling environment. You know, what are the critical factors that you've seen in your work? And also that question about continuity. Is it a problem with the system that we have, that we're working with, or is it purely for government turnover and other issues? So hopefully you can answer all of that in about 2 minutes for us, George.
I don't know if I'll get to it. Can I just make a quick comment about, Remy, what you said about housing? I think it's really, really important. I mean, in places like Bangladesh, the low-income areas you go to, it's impossible to see a future in these areas. I mean, how will these places upgrade? Is putting a toilet in seems so temporary, even if you do invest. And I think government has a big role to play. If you look at places like Ghana, we're asking a family, and they pay $4 per month for rent, but they pay $24 per month for using a public toilet. What the hell? The problem is there's rent control, which is great, but it's government's way to get the private sector to essentially subsidize low-income households so that they don't, the low-income households don't revolt and say we have no housing. So you have landlords that are just as poor as their tenants, and you have a lot of investment in new housing, a bit similar to here, where it's all high-end and no social housing because they can't charge enough for rent. They won't make any return on their investment. So I think housing is really, really important and a big issue. I'd love to deal with that, but it's complicated. On incentives, and maybe I'll link into some of the questions you're saying. I think the first question is incentives to do what? I think that's your first step. Do you want them to invest in something, whether it's infrastructure, equipment? Do you want them to target low-income households? They've big businesses that are targeting higher income. How do you get them to target lower income? Is it stopping illegal tipping, improve the quality of the service they provide? There's many different ways to structure your investment depending on what you want them to do. And that's the private sector. If you're looking at the public sector, it's a bit more complicated, I think. But it's trying to understand what their priorities are. I'll use the water example really quickly just because it's really clear. So when we were working with water utilities, a lot of them are more commercial than municipalities. Their bottom line is we need to cover their cost. So one of their big issues is non-revenue water, so losing from leaks, people not paying bills. So we want them to connect low-income households, but what we're doing as well, so we're supporting them in non-revenue water, which, I mean, there's not a direct relationship, as in, oh yeah, you save water, that means that water directly goes to low-income areas, but their bottom line is to reduce their non-revenue water, where they have strong regulation that says you can't increase your tariff until you reduce your non-revenue water, or whatever it is. they are very focused on, a lot of them are, some of them are, focused on reducing that. For sanitation, what as an example in Ghana, we're trying to push municipalities to put more money into sanitation, into their waste management department, their environmental health department, to ring fence in some way or to allocate more resources. And they said, well, where are we going to get the money from? So there's a huge learning curve that we're going through now, which is trying to help them with their revenue collection from household, what do you call it, tax, house tax? What is it called? I forget. Property rates. There you go, property tax. So as a water and sanitation organization, we don't have a lot of experience in that, but we're trying to learn. So it's a huge learning curve. But that is something, if you're asking them to invest more, you have to figure out, well, where are they going to get the money from? So it's really understanding their priorities, putting yourself in their shoes to try to get them to I don't think they understand the importance of sanitation. It's that you need to kind of encourage them and help them along with it. Yeah, I didn't address continuity, but I feel I've gone over my minutes.
Oh, that's okay. Well, thank you very much. I know we are just we're already at 12:30, which is the time for this session to end. And we've just got a question, or maybe it's just a comment from our online colleagues, which is Polly from Luwat Limited says, I completely agree with the last comment. You won't get organisations competing to provide treatment if there is no return and they are taking on all the risk. So to change this, you have to incentivise them properly. It's more than just paying for the cost of capital. You need to consider the ongoing costs, which is something we've been saying earlier. And we see this in Madagascar. An NGO built a great facility but didn't consider the incentives and skills of the actors. So another sharing example there, where I think this issue around understanding the incentives, having the right skill sets, but actually also having the right mentality. Because how do we persuade people that they want to go and shovel shit if they're not already working in a related environment or in a related kind of role? So with that, I'd like to thank all of you for the questions and also for the panel for their time and fantastic responses. And I'm sure they'll still be here at lunchtime, hopefully. So if you do have additional questions for them, please do come up and quiz them. I'm just assuming they're up for that and they're volunteering them. So thank you all again. And I think we start again at 1:30. Thank you.